Racist cop fires at black mother, then freezes. When her son arrives. They thought it was just another routine stop until a black mother was nearly killed in cold blood. But what those racist cops didn't know was that her son was trained relentless and already watching. What happened next turned a quiet southern town into ground zero for justice, and you won't believe how it ends. Stay with us. This story will shake you. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. Charleston, South Carolina doesn't rush, it breathes. The streets carry the echo of horse-drawn carriages and gospel choirs. Porches creak beneath rocking chairs, and the scent of magnolia drifts through the air like memory itself. On Ashley Avenue, in a historic neighborhood shaded by moss-draped oaks, nothing ever seems to happen, but what seems peaceful can be deceptive, because in America, sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest truths. It was just past 8:00 p.m. when Ruth Matthews left her daughter's house, humming softly to herself, the smell of sweet potato pie still clinging to her coat. She was 62 years old, widowed a former school teacher, and the kind of woman who kept extra umbrellas in her car for strangers caught in the rain. Her route home hadn't changed in 30 years. Same turns, same stop signs, same warm wave to the shopkeeper closing up near Rutledge and Cannon. She drove slowly, not out of fear, but because she had nothing to rush toward. Her house sat at the end of a narrow block, just past a Methodist church, where the bells chimed off-key, but faithfully. Her life was small but sacred. And then the lights appeared red and blue. A flash in the rearview mirror that made her chest tighten. She eased over without question, rolled down her window, turned off the ignition hands at 10 and 2, like she taught her son to do years ago. Because even when you've done nothing wrong, when you're black in America and the lights flash behind you, fear rides in the passenger seat. The officer didn't introduce himself. He barked, demanded ID, asked where she was going and why. She answered gently, her voice calm yet cautious. "Just heading home, sir. From my daughter's place." He asked if she'd been drinking. She hadn't. Then he asked if she had anything in the vehicle she shouldn't. Ruth blinked, confused. "Sir, no." Out of the car. Now something shifted in the air. She reached slowly for her purse, voice trembling now. "My license is right here. I'm not. Don't move," he shouted. The words cracked the night in two. The shout sliced through the quiet like a blade, and before she could explain, before she could even breathe, the gun was out. The shot echoed down the block, bounced off brick walls and stained glass windows. A single round fired point blank through the driver's side door. The bullet missed her heart by inches. Ruth Matthews slumped forward, blood blooming across her side like a red flower wilting in the dark. Her scream never came, only the groan of disbelief and the rasp of breath, shallow and wet. The officer, Darren Cole, stood frozen for half a second. Then panic set in. He radioed for backup with a voice suddenly laced in artificial urgency. Suspect reached for something. Shots fired, requesting medical. But there was no weapon. Only a leather wallet and a pair of reading glasses now resting on the floor mat. The body camera wasn't rolling. He claimed it malfunctioned. The dash cam, blocked by angle and conveniently corrupted. The story was ready before the ambulance arrived. Ruth Matthews had reached into her purse after repeated warnings. They said she was non-compliant. They said Officer Cole feared for his life. Ruth didn't die that night, but she almost did. And in many ways, a part of her never fully came back. What they didn't know, what that officer couldn't have known, was that Ruth Matthews wasn't just anyone. She was the mother of someone they should never have crossed. Jamal Matthews had left Charleston 10 years earlier, a decorated Army intelligence officer who vanished after his final tour. No social media, no mailing address, just whispers from old friends that he'd gone off-grid, working in places that don't exist on maps. When Jamal got the call, he didn't answer, but he listened. And when he heard the words, "They shot Mom. She's alive," but barely. His world went still. His breath froze in his chest, his knuckles whitened around the phone, and for the first time in years, the war he thought he'd left behind came roaring back. Not on foreign soil, but right on his mother's street. Jamal didn't ask what hospital. He already knew. He didn't ask who fired the shot. That would come soon enough. He closed his laptop, stood from the unmarked table in an unnamed city, and said 5 words to the man across from him. "I need to go home." In the quiet streets of Charleston, they thought it was over. They called it a tragic incident, said the department would review it internally. The media moved on. Officer Darren Cole returned to desk duty, but the real story hadn't begun yet, not until the sun came back, not until Jamal started asking questions no one wanted to answer, not until the quiet became a roar. Because Charleston had buried its truth for too long beneath beauty, beneath charm, beneath the lie. That racism was past tense. And Ruth Matthews, she wasn't another statistic. She was the spark. And Jamal Matthews, he was the fire. You may think you know how this ends, but you don't. Because when they fired that shot, they didn't just hit a black woman driving home, they awakened a reckoning, and no one was ready for what came next. The news never said her name with enough weight. When Charleston's local station ran the segment the next morning, it lasted under a minute. An officer-involved shooting late last night on Ashley Avenue left a 62-year-old woman injured. Police say the suspect reached for her purse during a routine traffic stop, prompting a defensive response. The woman is recovering at Memorial Medical Center. No charges had been filed. No outrage, no camera footage. Just another line in the endless scroll of headlines the world forgets by lunchtime. But Tiana Matthews didn't forget. She sat by her mother's hospital bed, her hand wrapped around Ruth's bruised and bloodied fingers, wondering how the world kept spinning like nothing had happened. Ruth's breathing was shallow, aided by a machine that hissed rhythmically beside her. A bullet had torn through her left side, cracked a rib, and nicked her lung. The doctor said she was lucky to be alive. Tiana wasn't so sure. Charleston buzzed outside tourists, snapping photos in front of pastel-painted homes. Ghost tours winding through cobblestone alleys and horse-drawn carriages clip-clopping down Broad Street like everything was just as it should be. But Tiana could feel it. The silence pressing in like fog, thick, deliberate. The kind of silence that knows how to bury things, how to dress tragedy in polite phrasing and move on before anyone notices the blood on the pavement. The mayor made a brief statement, a regrettable misunderstanding. The police chief promised a full review, but no one called Ruth by name. No one asked who she was, what kind of life she had built, or what it meant to nearly lose her without warning, without reason. But someone was asking Jamal. He didn't go to the hospital, not right away. He didn't call Tiana, didn't knock on the front door. Instead, he watched from across the street, from behind mirrored lenses, from the edge of a city he hadn't walked in a decade. Charleston hadn't changed much. The streets were the same. The buildings wore time like old silk. But Jamal had changed. He'd traded his uniform for silence, his identity for shadows. And what he saw now wasn't just home. It was a system still sick with the same disease it always had. The difference was now he knew how to fight it. He started with the officer's name, Darren Cole, a 10-year veteran of the force. Commendations for bravery. No public complaints on his record, too neat, too clean. Jamal's instincts screamed cover-up. He dug deeper. He hacked through firewall after firewall, slipped into digital crevices most people didn't even know existed, and there, buried in old reports, scrubbed files, the truth began to bleed through. 5 years earlier, Cole had shot another unarmed black man during a traffic stop. No charges filed, footage lost in a technical failure. A year later, a teenager arrested for resisting was found with a broken jaw in the back of Cole's cruiser. The boy's mother tried to press charges. The case was dismissed before it reached court. It was always the same story. No witnesses, no proof, no consequences. But this time Cole hadn't just targeted anyone. He had targeted a woman with a son trained to take apart systems exactly like this one. Jamal mapped out the precinct structure. He studied shift rotations, precinct hierarchies, who held power, who looked the other way, and who might be willing to speak if they felt safe enough. He wasn't looking for noise, he was building pressure, and he was methodical about it. While the city slept, he found the precinct's surveillance blind spots. He listened to radio chatter, he planted digital breadcrumbs in police servers that led to encrypted drop boxes. Inside them he placed files, photos, redacted reports he had quietly reconstructed. It wasn't just revenge, it was precision. He moved through Charleston like a ghost. Every intersection whispered memories. Every familiar porch stirred something long buried inside him. But Jamal wasn't here to reminisce. He was here to expose the lie Charleston wrapped in charm for decades. And then came the break he needed. He timed it perfectly. 2 days after the shooting, an anonymous leak hit the inbox of Maya Clark, a freelance journalist known for poking holes in Charleston's genteel mask. She was bold, relentless, and unafraid of losing access because she never played the access game. She read the files once, then again. Her hands trembled as she scanned each page. "Dear God," she whispered. The documents weren't just damning, they were undeniable. Patterns, dates, quotes. Internal memos that had been buried, victim statements that had disappeared. She didn't wait. She printed the files, she called her editor, and then she started writing like her fingers were on fire. The next morning, her article dropped. Headline, "Pattern of Violence. The cop behind last week's shooting has a history." It hit harder than anyone expected. Ruth Matthews had a name now. A face. A history the city couldn't ignore. Photos of her as a school teacher. Testimonials from former students. A timeline of Officer Darren Cole's record that read like a blueprint for systemic abuse. Suddenly, Charleston wasn't quiet anymore. Activists gathered outside the Charleston Police Department. Candles flickered on the corner of Ashley Avenue. Social media lit up with "Justice for Ruth." The streets that once hummed with silence now pulsed with urgency. Even church bells seemed to ring louder that Sunday, but still no arrest, no suspension. Just more press conferences, more promises. Jamal watched it unfold from a rooftop 3 blocks from City Hall, his arms crossed, jaw clenched. "This isn't justice yet," he muttered. "This is the fuse." He wasn't trying to spark a riot. He was orchestrating something far more dangerous to the system: accountability. That night, Jamal returned to the small apartment he had quietly rented on the outskirts of town. It was bare, just a mattress, a folding table, and a stack of files. But on the wall, taped with surgical precision, was a war board, photos, names, timelines, all connected with red thread like a detective's fever dream. He didn't sleep. He reviewed every document Maya had released, comparing it with what he'd uncovered but hadn't yet exposed. There was more. So much more: whistleblowers, retired officers, one anonymous tip about a secret gray file room where misconduct reports went to die. He knew that to truly crack Charleston open, he needed more than leaks. He needed testimony. And so he started reaching out to people like Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, who had seen too much and been silent for too long. To Harold King, the retired officer who once looked away. To mothers like his who had stared into flashing lights and feared they might never see tomorrow. "Let me tell your story," Jamal said again and again. "We don't need a martyr. We need a memory that fights back." Jamal knew better than to wait for justice to come on its own. He wasn't trying to make noise for the sake of it. He wanted weight, irreversible truth. He was done letting the city speak in platitudes and polished denial. Late one night, Tiana returned home to find a small envelope slid under her door. No return address, no note, just her name written in neat block letters inside a flash drive. She hesitated. Her fingers hovered above the laptop's trackpad as her pulse quickened. She took a breath and clicked. What played on screen made her breath catch. It wasn't from the cruiser. It wasn't from police body cam. It was from a bakery security camera across the street, angled just right, clear enough to shatter every lie. It captured everything. The moment Officer Darren Cole fired into Ruth's car. No aggression, no sudden move. Ruth's hands were visible, raised open still. The image froze on her face, shocked, vulnerable human. Then the shot. Tiana slapped a hand over her mouth. Her eyes welled, body shaking. No. No, she whispered. She did everything right. The footage had a timestamp. It was real, undeniable, and damning. She called Jamal for the first time in years. You did this, didn't you? There was a pause on the other end, then his voice came quiet but firm. Someone had to. The video went viral overnight. It blazed across Twitter, Facebook national broadcasts. Hashtags trended. People who'd never heard Ruth Matthews's name now knew her story, and the name of the man who pulled the trigger. The department was forced to suspend Officer Cole. This time, the investigation wasn't internal. It was external. Federal under public pressure. But Jamal wasn't finished, because Charleston hadn't seen what he'd become. It hadn't seen what a son willing to burn his past down to protect his mother could do. He wasn't just here to expose one corrupt cop. He was here to dismantle the silence that had protected men like Darren Cole for generations. The city stirred like something ancient waking from slumber. By the end of the week, Charleston was on edge. Protest signs lined the iron fences outside City Hall. News vans hovered like vultures circling for blood scandal and spectacle. But beneath the noise behind the headlines, Jamal Matthews worked in silence, because he wasn't here for a spectacle. He was building something deeper, lasting, unstoppable. He had seen it all before, outrage that burned fast and died faster. But he wasn't building a moment. He was building a movement. Every night he met with people in hushed corners of church basements, in the back rooms of barber shops and community centers. They didn't need speeches, they needed direction. Most of them had lived in Charleston all their lives. They had lost uncles, cousins, sons to this same system quietly, anonymously. They didn't want revenge. They wanted change. It started with storytelling. Jamal would sit in circles with the elders, recording their memories of life before smartphones and digital outrage. Back when injustice didn't trend, it just knocked on your door and stayed a while. He knew the weight of silence. He knew it wasn't just the lies that broke people. It was the things left unsaid, the truths buried beneath shame and fear. One woman, a retired librarian named Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, wept as she told the story of her brother arrested at 19 for loitering, beaten in the alley behind the jail. There were no photos, no records, just pain and silence. And that silence Jamal knew. It was the real enemy. So he built something new. He created a digital archive, a living testimony of pain the city had long forgotten. And with Maya Clark, the journalist who had risked her career to publish the truth, they launched an independent platform called Eyes on Charleston. Within days, stories poured in. Names that had only existed in whispers now had a place to breathe, and for the first time in decades, Charleston's memory stretched back further than just last week's outrage. But Jamal also knew a movement couldn't live online alone. It had to touch the ground. He recruited a small team of organizers, young, determined, unafraid. They canvassed neighborhoods. They held legal workshops teaching people how to request body cam footage, how to file public records requests, how to document encounters with law enforcement safely. They weren't just speaking truth to power, they were arming others with the tools to do the same. Tiana watched it all with cautious awe. She had never seen her brother like this, not since before the deployments, before the shadows, before the silence swallowed him. He had returned not as the broken man she feared, but as someone sharper, clearer, forged by purpose. But she also saw the weight. The nights he'd stare at their mother's hospital chart, his jaw-locked hands trembling under the table. Ruth was healing, but slowly. Some days she spoke, other days she didn't. Some mornings her voice returned with its warmth. Other nights her eyes drifted into the distance like a ghost trying to remember how to stay. The fire in her spirit had dimmed, and that haunted Jamal more than anything. It pushed him harder. And when the city announced a community town hall to address the unrest, Jamal saw through it instantly. "It's not about healing," he told Maya in a low voice. "It's damage control." The mayor would talk. The police chief would offer apologies rehearsed 100 times. Darren Cole would remain suspended, unfired, uncharged. So Jamal flipped the script. He gathered everyone: Tiana, Maya, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the organizers, former students of Ruth and mothers who had buried sons without answers. They didn't just attend the town hall, they took it over. The auditorium was standing room only. People lined the walls, shoulders pressed, eyes burning with purpose. The city council sat behind folding tables at the front, shuffling papers nervously. The mayor, pressed and polished, stepped up to the mic with his signature tone of concern. But before he could speak, Jamal stood, tall, calm, resolute. "No more statements," he said, voice steady. "Tonight we're listening. You're listening." He turned the mic toward the audience, and for 2 straight hours, Charleston heard its own reflection. One by one, voices ignored for generations stood and spoke. Tiana read a letter her mother had written while recovering shaky handwriting, every word soaked in pain and strength. "I was afraid I was confused, but I will not be erased," Ruth wrote. A high school student named Brianna James stepped forward. She looked only 16 but held the mic like a warrior. "I flinch every time a cruiser passes. That's not freedom," she said. "That's fear." A former black officer, Mr. Harold King, stood next Gray at the temples. Voice rough with regret, "I saw men like Cole abuse that badge. And I said nothing. Because I was scared. Because I thought silence protected me." Silence cracked, and something deep inside that auditorium shattered. By the time the mayor returned to the mic, his voice was thin. "Shaken, we'll review all active duty officer conduct," he offered. But even he knew it wasn't enough, because something had shifted. Charleston wasn't asleep anymore, and Jamal Matthews, he had done more than expose a cop. He had shown the city how to see itself, the unspoken rules, the invisible lines, the systems too sacred to question. Now they were laid bare, and he wasn't the only one leading anymore. The community was rising with him. The next day, the police union called a press conference. Reporters expected them to defend Cole, expected more stonewalling, expected silence wrapped in legal jargon. But something had cracked. The old shields of loyalty were no longer strong enough under pressure from within. And after Maya Clark published financial records showing campaign donations linked to the union's leadership, they reversed course. They called for a full investigation and a third-party oversight board, public trust. The spokesperson said voice strained and rehearsed is more important than loyalty. Charleston wasn't healed, but for the first time, it was bleeding honestly. Outside City Hall, Jamal stood watching the crowd disperse. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He felt the weight of every sleepless night, every document decrypted, every memory unearthed. It was working. He knew it wouldn't last forever. New battles would come. There would always be another name, another face, another mother who didn't make it home. But for now, for this moment, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the story of Charleston wouldn't end the way it always had. Maybe this time the people would write the ending, and this time it wouldn't be in silence. It was one thing to stir a city's conscience. It was another to walk into a courtroom and force a system to see what it had tried so long to ignore. Jamal Matthews had never stepped foot in a courthouse as anything other than a silent observer, a black man whose presence made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. But today, he entered as the storm. The State versus Officer Darren Cole was scheduled to begin on a cloudless Monday morning in Charleston's oldest courthouse. The building with its columns and marble steps had long been a symbol of tradition, though not always justice. Inside, the temperature felt colder, not from the air conditioning, but from the weight of legacy that hung like iron in its halls. For generations, this was where names like Ruth Matthews were ignored, where men in uniform were shielded by technicalities and silence. But now something was different. The courtroom was full before the clock struck 9. Reporters lined the back walls. Civil rights attorneys from out of state took seats behind the prosecution. Maya sat near the front, notebook in hand, though this time she didn't write. She simply bore witness. Tiana clutched her mother's hand, her own nerves battling the quiet rage that had lived in her since that night. And then there was Jamal. He stood tall, still his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the man seated at the defense table, Darren Cole. The officer sat like a man who still believed he would walk free. He wore the same cold stare, the same smug tilt of the chin he had the night he pulled the trigger. His lawyer, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, exuded confidence. After all, this was Charleston, and to some, Cole was still one of theirs, but what no one expected was what the prosecution brought to the stand. First came the medical examiner, cool, precise. "Her wounds," he said, pointing to the diagram, were survivable. It was the 12-minute delay in medical attention that nearly killed her, a delay caused not by danger, but by protocol, because Officer Cole didn't call it in. Gasps, whispers, silence. Then came the dispatcher voice, trembling. She admitted what internal audits later confirmed. The body cam footage, which should have been rolling from the moment Cole approached the car, had been manually disabled. Not a malfunction, she clarified, a choice. The courtroom shifted, jurors shifted, 6 white, 4 black, 2 Latino. Truth has a way of pressing down until even comfort can't hold it anymore. Then came the moment no one expected, the prosecution's final witness, Officer Rachel Morgan Cole's former patrol partner. She walked into the courtroom small in frame, but powerful in presence. She had resigned 6 months before the shooting, citing workplace stress. But what she revealed shook the courtroom to its core. She spoke of complaints, dozens, none of which made it past review. She spoke of racial slurs muttered beneath breath after every traffic stop involving black drivers. She recounted one night when Cole boasted, "They don't run this city, we do." Her hands shook. "I was scared," she confessed. "But when I saw what they did to that grandmother, when I saw them try to paint Ruth Matthews as a threat, I knew fear wasn't an excuse anymore." A stillness fell over the room. Jamal didn't blink. Tiana squeezed his arm. He reached for her hand without looking. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The defense scrambled. They called Rachel Morgan bitter, said she exaggerated, that she was just angry, just emotional, but the damage was done. The jury had heard too much, seen too much, felt too much. After 4 days, they deliberated for only 6 hours, and when the verdict was read, guilty, the word echoed, not just in the courtroom, but in living rooms, in schools, in barber shops and cafes. People didn't cheer. Not at first. They sat in the weight of it, the shock that something long denied had finally been acknowledged. Cole didn't look at Jamal as he was led away. He kept his eyes on the floor, as if meeting the gaze of the people he tried to erase might make him disappear. But Jamal saw him fully, not just as a man, but as a symbol of something crumbling. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered silent until the doors opened, until they saw the face of a mother who lived. Then came the applause, not for vengeance, but for survival, for truth, for the courage it had taken to drag justice into the light. Ruth was there in a wheelchair, bundled in a coat despite the spring air. She hadn't spoken much in days, but when Jamal knelt beside her, her hand found his cheek. Her lips parted, "You came back," she whispered. "I never left," Jamal replied, voice cracking. And he hadn't. Not really. Because the boy she raised, the one who used to sit beside her in the pews of Emmanuel Church, had grown into a man who wouldn't let the story end in silence. A man who understood that justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about memory, about making sure the next grandmother didn't have to survive a bullet just to be believed. That night the city lit candles, no rallies, no riots, just flickers of light in windows across Charleston. A quiet defiance, a soft burning promise that they would remember what happened here. Jamal stood outside his mother's house and looked down the street, each flickering light like a heartbeat. For the first time in a long time, Charleston was awake, and the silence it was broken. The verdict had been read. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of what happened inside that building didn't fade. They rippled outward, carried by every voice that refused to be quiet, by every footstep that marched not in anger, but in memory. Charleston, once a city cloaked in polite denial, had been forced to reckon with itself. But what happens after the reckoning? Jamal Matthews didn't disappear once the cameras left. He didn't retreat into the quiet of his mother's home. He didn't vanish back into the shadows of military life. He stayed. Not because Charleston had changed overnight, but because real change demands roots. And Jamal knew the fight wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in classrooms, in city council meetings across kitchen tables. He started showing up in places he once avoided. Police reform meetings, neighborhood planning sessions, high school assemblies, not as a symbol, as a man, a son. Ruth's recovery was slow, but she never missed a Sunday service once she could walk again, even with a cane in hand. The second pew welcomed her back like a long-lost hymn. With her return came a sense of calm to a community still holding its breath. But Ruth didn't want calm. She wanted action. At her insistence, she and Tiana launched the Light Her Way initiative, an outreach program focused on empowering Black mothers and grandmothers to speak out against abuse and silence. They held healing circles in church basements. They partnered with young activists and legal advocates. They made space for every voice, even the quietest ones. To Rise, Maya Clark continued her work too. Her reporting had gone national, but she remained local. Not because she had to, but because the story wasn't over. She started a weekly newsletter, not just about crime or scandal, but about restoration, about how communities like theirs were learning not to look away anymore. And then something unexpected happened. Officer Rachel Morgan, the same woman whose testimony cracked Cole's defense wide open, returned not to policing, but to mentorship. She founded a program for young officers, aiming to reteach what the badge should mean: protection, not power. She met resistance, of course, but for every door slammed shut, a new one opened. People were watching now, and accountability was no longer optional. As for Jamal, he stood one afternoon at the corner of Calhoun and King beside a new bronze plaque embedded in the sidewalk. It bore his mother's name. Not because she died, but because she lived, because she endured, because she inspired others to stand when silence was easier. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. Car horns, laughter, church bells, life. And in that life there was purpose. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a discipline, a choice. And Charleston had just begun. Because justice isn't just a verdict. It's what we build afterward, so no mother has to fear, no son has to avenge, and no truth ever has to wait this long to be heard. In the quiet corners of Charleston, beneath the sweet scent of magnolia and the worn bricks of historic streets, a story unfolded that was never meant to stay silent. It began with a routine stop, a flash of red and blue, a Black mother on her way home, and two officers whose badges masked something far more dangerous than authority: prejudice, entitlement, and a belief that some lives mattered less. Ruth Matthews. a woman of unwavering grace and strength, became the target that night. And when bullets tore through the air, it wasn't just her body that was wounded, it was the soul of a city. But what they didn't expect was her son, Jamal. Matthews wasn't just a man with military training. He was shaped by love, by memory, by the gentle touch of a mother who had weathered storms her whole life. And when she was nearly taken from him, he didn't meet violence with violence. He met it with strategy, with truth, with the fierce resolve of someone who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. He returned not as a vigilante, but as a reckoning. Through his investigation with the help of unlikely allies, Officer Rachel Morgan, journalist Maya Clark, and a chorus of awakened citizens, Jamal dismantled a system that had been rotting from the inside out. Darren Cole, long protected by his badge and silence, was brought to justice, not by bullets, but by accountability. And Charleston, once complicit in its forgetting, was forced to remember. This story is more than survival or justice. It is a testament to the power of memory, of resilience, and of community. It reminds us justice doesn't come from one grand act, it comes from the countless small ones, the testimony given when it's risky, the questions asked when they're uncomfortable, the truth spoken even when it shakes the ground. The lesson is this: silence is not neutral. When we turn our heads from injustice, we become part of it, but when we choose to bear witness, to speak up, to stand beside those who've been pushed down, we become agents of change. We don't all have to be warriors like Jamal, or survivors like Ruth, but we can refuse to be bystanders. We can be part of the resistance to hate, to fear, to forgetting. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Let it be the spark for your own conversations, your own convictions. And if you believe in lifting up stories that matter, stories that shine light into dark places, subscribe to this channel. Your support fuels the fire to keep telling the truth, to keep honoring the unheard, and to keep building a world where justice doesn't have to be chased. It simply is.